Your ATM card has more protections on it.
And we will take you live now to South Carolina, West Columbia, where Congressman Mick Mulvaney will be introducing Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. This is live Road to the White House 2016 coverage on C-SPAN.
Or something like that. And Joe was able to sleep on the plane, and I sat next to Mr. Clyburn the whole way. So that was an interesting way. Thanks, y'all, for doing this tonight. I've been asked to introduce a friend of mine. In Washington, there's a saying that if you want a friend, get a dog. And that's for the most part because you can't trust anybody up there. Somebody who's your friend one day is usually just trying to get something out of you, and they tend to disappear the next day. I haven't followed that rule precisely since I've been there. I've actually made some very good friends, some of my best friends. You all know and have heard, and I tell you it's true how close Trey and Jeff and Tim and I have become over the last couple of years. And I'm also proud to say that the Scoutmaster is a good friend of mine. Where did he go? He's up against the wall. So he's still the senior member of the delegation, even with His Excellency there now. So I do have some good friends, but not many. It's very difficult to make friends in Washington, D.C. But tonight I've been asked to introduce one of those people. Talk is relatively cheap in Washington. Most of it is, at least. Some of the talk is actually pretty good. In fact, I remember when I first got to Washington, Senator DeMint called and said, look, you've been doing some good work over there with the guys. I want you to get together, come over and meet some of my friends on the Senate side. And we started getting together once or twice a month to have dinner and talk about conservative issues. And Senator DeMint would bring over some of the senators, and Trey and Jeff and I would go with 4 or 5 other folks, and we'd go over and sit down and talk about things. That's actually where Cut, Cap, and Balance got started. We started talking about the debt ceiling, talking about the fiscal cliff, those types of things. And that's the good kind of talk, because most talk up in Washington is just that. It's very rare that you see that talk actually go into action. And that's where you learn where the real leaders are. What I hear from all of you, across South Carolina, when we hear crazy things happening in Washington, and there's that certain outrage, and you reach out and you call me, or you call Joe, or you call Trey or Jeff, and you're outraged at what's happening in the country. And you expect us to do more than just talk about it up in Washington, D.C. There's very few people who do that. There's very few people who take that outrage that you and I share about some of the most important things that face our country and turn that into action. And the gentleman who's speaking to you today is one of those rare people who takes that outrage and those words and turns them into action. By now, you know what happened when he took a relatively simple question and turned it into in my mind, one of the great examples of action in Washington, D.C. this year. Took a simple question: is it okay for the United States government to kill United States citizens with drones? Now, ordinarily, you would expect the answer to that to be no. If the answer to that is anything other than no, you would be, should be, and were outraged, because the answer to that question was not no. In fact, it was far from no out of Eric Holder. And while a lot of us talked about it in Washington, D.C., the gentleman you're about to hear actually went up and did something about it. By now, you're all familiar with the stand with Rand filibuster. I don't know how long you talked, 12 hours, 14, forever? Yeah. And by the way, if you understand the rules of the filibuster, you know just what a tremendous physical accomplishment that is. But it hasn't just been on our individual liberties. It wasn't just on the filibuster. It's been on gun control. Just yesterday, this awful Senate bill that got passed was the type of thing that Rand stood up and not only spoke against, but is taking action against. There are other reasons he's my friend. I could tell you about how we play baseball together, not particularly well. There are some who believe that his drop pop fly in left field led to our loss, but since our loss was 22-0, it's highly unlikely that the Republicans lost just because of Rand. I could also tell you how I beat him in golf, but if I did that, then I have to explain how his 13-year-old son beat me in golf, and I don't like to talk about that. So it's more than just policy. You're about to see someone who is on the short list of friends of mine. He's a great leader, a great senator, and a great honor to have him here in South Carolina. My friend, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky.
Now, Mick neglected to mention that it's a short list of friends, right? It's just a short list. So, And he also neglected, I don't know how my errors came up, but of course none of his errors seemed to come up, But no, we play every year, the Democrats, and we're still pretty mad about this. We got beat 22-0 this year. Last year, 20-4 or something. I mean, 4 years in a row we've been beaten. And they've got this one young pitcher. He's 32 years old, and he played baseball in college. And it's just, and I say, look, Democrats, you guys love regulations so much. Why don't we pass a regulation that says your pitcher can only pitch for 2 innings? So far, we haven't gotten any word back from them on that. So I also have asked them, it's like, you guys like equality of outcome, right? So maybe we need to get 6 outs per inning, and if y'all score 6 runs, why don't you give us 6 runs, just to be fair? But so far, they're for dog-eat-dog capitalism when it gets out on the baseball field. I got up early this morning, and I couldn't find my cell phone. I looked everywhere for it, but I couldn't go without my cell phone. So I went in and asked Harry Reid if I could borrow his phone. So Harry Reid gave me my phone. Do you think the NSA is going to be surprised to see Harry Reid at a Republican gathering in South Carolina? I get a lot of my news from Jimmy Kimmel, and so Jimmy Kimmel said the president the other day was at an intermediate school, a middle school. And so he was offering something free, which he usually does. He was offering free high-speed internet. But it was a kind of an awkward moment because a kid piped up and raised his hand and says, "Why? So you can read my email faster?" There was a little girl who wanted $100, and she said, "I'll do good things with it." So she wrote a letter to God. She said, "Dear God, please send me $100. The postmaster got it, and he said, "Well, that's really cute. That's kind of neat, but where do I mail it?" And he said, "Well, why don't I just mail it to the president?" So he sent it to the president, and the president said, "Well, that's cute." And he said to his secretary, "Send the little girl $5. She'll think that's a lot of money." So she got the $5, and she was like, but her parents said, "Always write a thank you." So she wrote a thank you to God. She said, "Dear God, thanks for the $5. But next time, don't send it through Washington. They stole 95% of it." I was also watching Jimmy Kimmel the other night, and he was talking about the sequester. So he does a man on the street. Anybody seen him do the man on the street thing? So he goes out, man on the street, and he says, "Pardon me, ma'am, but have you heard that the president has pardoned the sequester and sent it to Portugal?" One after another, he said this to people, and the people would come up and go, "Oh, damn right, they deserve it over there." You wonder who's voting in the election. So then he went up to one woman and he said, "You've heard North Korea's rattling and threatening to bomb and doing these weapons tests. You heard the president has sent them the sequester." And they're once again, "Damn right, they deserve it." We have a problem. We've got a disconnect. We've got a disconnect between an electorate who doesn't know what a sequester is or where Benghazi is, but we have them still, engaging in the public debate, maybe, showing up to vote, maybe. But it's a problem. We need an informed electorate. Our country really needs to have more information out there. Now, on the sequester, I think we're actually winning the battle on this, the public relations battle. The president said, "The sky is falling. The world will end. Oh my, we cannot possibly have this sequester," which is a cut in the rate of increase in spending. If you've seen the chart on TV, here's without the sequester, here's with the sequester. Spending goes up with or without the sequester. But we survived. The world isn't ending. He tried to say, "Oh, we have to close down the White House. We can't have the self-guided tours in the White House." Well, the same week he announced no self-guided tours in the White House, you know what he did? He found an extra $250 million to send to Egypt. So we've got money lying around in a shoebox somewhere that we can send to Egypt. We sent F-16s to Egypt. We sent M1 tanks to Egypt. So we've got no money. The cupboard's bare, but we've got money to send overseas. And I don't know about you, but when I see a mob on television burning the American flag and chanting "Death to America," I say, not one penny more. I'm not sending them another dime. Now, the president says, where would we possibly cut? What could we cut? How are we going to deal with this sequester? We waited a year and a half to even ask the question. It was passed in 2011. A year and a half later, he says, oh, what are we going to do? We're going to have to cut out the air traffic controllers, the meat inspectors. Your meat's going to be rancid. Planes are going to be crashing into each other. It's like, we got a $4 trillion government, and that's the first thing you're going to cut? Meat inspectors and air traffic controllers? I think people saw through it and saw it, frankly, as a charade. They saw that he was playing games, and I think he's losing respect from the public for this, because he's sending. I mean, Egypt's gotten over $2 billion this year from us. We are still sending money to Pakistan. Pakistan imprisoned the doctor, Dr. Shakil Afridi, who helped us to get bin Laden for the rest of his life. And what do? We say, oh, please release him, but here's another $1 billion. They don't understand that kind of leverage. They understand, don't send them anything, and they'll say release them. I introduced an amendment in the Senate that said no more money to Pakistan unless you release it. And my opinion is you really shouldn't send it at all, but being the moderate that I am, I said we'd give it back to you. You release him and you'd actually get all your back foreign aid that you think you deserve if you release him. I got 20 votes in the Senate. I lost over half of the Republicans on this and all of the Democrats. But if you ask the public this issue, I frankly say I can go, if this were the Democratic fundraiser in Colombia, it wouldn't be this big probably. But if it were, I think I can tell them the same thing. We shouldn't be sending money to countries that hate us, to countries that are burning our flag. I think it's popular whether it's Republican, Democrat, or Independent. But in Washington, it's the opposite. They still think no one will be our friend unless we send them money. The president of Egypt, Morsi, stands next to a sheikh, his spiritual leader, who says death to Israel, who says Israel is the descendants of pigs and dogs. Israelis are the descendants of pigs and dogs. There's Morsi saying amen. So I have another idea for an amendment, and so far they haven't let me vote on this one. They don't really like to vote on these things. I have another idea for an amendment. Why don't we ask President Morsi to publicly affirm the Camp David Accords, to publicly recognize Israel's right to exist before he gets another penny? Interestingly, though, nobody wants to vote on these amendments. We also have talked about what could you do to cut spending? For example, on the sequester. If you simply just don't rehire people who retire from government's got a couple of million employees, just don't rehire the people who retire, that's $6 billion a year. So the year and a half he waited, that's $9 billion. We really literally only needed about $40 billion. You're 25% of the way there. We spend $9 billion on air travel. One of the things that galls me to no end is I'll have people from some local government agency in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where I live and have office hours, fly to Washington, stay in a $500 a night hotel to try to meet me in Washington when I'm running hither and yon, and they could have met with me in Bowling Green for no expense. We spend, I think it's $9 billion on travel. I propose we cut 25% of that. That's $2.25 billion, and exclude the military from the cuts in travel. If you wanted to simply have competitive contracts, in government we don't give the business to the lowest bidder. We give it to the lowest bidder that's using union scale wages out of Chicago. We have a prevailing wage law or a Davis-Bacon law that says, if maybe the average carpenter in Columbia makes $35 an hour. If it's a federal project, you got to pay $70 an hour. So your schools that are built with federal money, your roads that are built with federal money cost 20, sometimes 30% more. So I introduced another idea. Why don't we get rid of Davis-Bacon? Saves $10 billion a year. But I don't think the president was really listening, so I came up with a few other ideas maybe to get his attention. For example, we spent $325,000 on a robotic squirrel last year. Now you would ask, why would we need a robotic squirrel? Well, these scientists had an interesting question. They wanted to know if a rattlesnake would strike a squirrel that wasn't wagging its tail. But they couldn't get a squirrel to volunteer not to wag its tail. So they built a robotic squirrel, doesn't wag its tail, and guess what? A rattlesnake will bite the you-know-what out of a squirrel that's not wagging its tail. $325,000. We spent $500,000 developing a menu for Mars. Doesn't really seem like a pressing need to me, but if you have a kid living in your house, one of your children that you wish were getting a job and not living in your basement, they're 26 years old and you're waiting for them to move out, this is a perfect job for them. There's a lot of government grants like this. Pays $5,000 to be in the study, 2 weeks, all paid expenses. It was done in Hawaii. I don't know why you have to develop. I guess the rocky landscape makes you think you're on Mars. The prerequisites for being in the study were pretty strict. Your kid had to like food. And after spending $5,000 per person for all expensive paid trip to Hawaii, they discovered that the best thing that these kids could come up with, college kids, pizza. That cost us $500,000. Some of this, though, is in the military. People say, you're not going to go to South Carolina and talk about waste in the military, are you? There's waste everywhere. Anybody that's ever been in the military knows there's waste. Doesn't mean I'm against national defense. National defense is the most important thing we spend money on. It's one of the few legitimate constitutional functions. It should be a priority. It doesn't mean a blank check. I think we should audit the Pentagon. Pentagon says they're too big to be audited. That's an insult to every taxpayer in the country. We should audit the Pentagon. Too big to be audited? In the Pentagon's budget, Tom Coburn found this out, who's one of the great deficit hawks and waste warriors up there. He found $7 billion in research unrelated to the military in the Pentagon's budget. Why? Because most of us feel a patriotic call to vote for the defense budget. We always vote for it and it passes, so people cram it full of goodies. $7 billion. It had in it $1.8 million for a study to develop roll-up beef jerky. Now, I'm not sure how that's keeping the Russians or the Iranians at bay, but roll-up beef jerky. It had $5 million in there to study the collective action of fish. And I dogged this grant, and I got responses from the scientists. They said I didn't understand really what they were trying to do, which is true. And I called a bunch of goldfish, which they were actually called golden fish. So, but the bottom line is there's a lot of money being wasted in a $4 trillion budget, and we could go through hundreds and hundreds of programs. One more, $3 million spent to study monkeys on meth. Does anybody not know that monkeys are as crazy as people on meth? I mean, that's ridiculous. But it runs from top to bottom throughout government. And so the idea that we can't cut, I think we're defeating that idea, and that's one of the great things about the sequester is we're surviving it. Now, would I do it across the whole of budget so defense doesn't have to get as much? Yes, I would have done the sequester. In fact, if you do a 1% sequester across the entire budget, the budget balances within 5 to 6 years. It's called the penny plan. Connie Mack came up with this idea. I've endorsed it. A lot of people have endorsed it. Cut 1%. And you're like, no way. We have a $1 trillion budget and you can cut 1%. The reason is that you cut 1% from a baseline of 0. Everything they talk about in Washington is a lie. The budget is going up. The baseline goes up like at 5%. So when they say, you remember the debt commission, they were going to cut $4 trillion was the minimum we had to cut. And we never got close to that. But $4 trillion out of the increase of $9 trillion. If you want to freeze your budget for 10 years, the CBO would call that a $9 trillion cut because spending is anticipated to go up $9 trillion. So when we talk about a 1% cut, it's from a baseline of 0. It's only about a $38 billion cut, but CBO would call it a $600 billion cut each year because they're planning on getting more money. We have to get away from all the craziness with this. I've had a few questions for Hillary Clinton. She hasn't really answered them to my satisfaction. And I've got a few more that keep cropping up all the time, so I'm hoping we get her back or that Trey's committee and ISIS committee will bring her back. I frankly think she isn't telling the truth. I asked her point blank, were we sending arms from Libya to Turkey to Syria, and might that have had something to do with the terrorist attack that happened? She says she had never heard of it. It's in the New York Times. It's been written about 10 times. It's been on Fox News. These are all unofficial sources. Maybe it's classified, but my question is, if it's classified, are you allowed to lie? That's what came up with the NSA recently, with a national intelligence director came before the Senate, and he was actually prompted in advance. Senator Wyden called his office and says, I'm going to ask you this question. I don't want to spring it on you. I want you to think about the question. Is the NSA collecting any data on Americans? And he said in public forum, no, we're not collecting any data on Americans. It's an out-and-out lie. It's against the law to lie to us. What does that do? People say the leaks have damaged our security. You know what's damaged our security is lying, because now I don't know whether to trust them. They now say that there are 50 terrorists we couldn't have caught without this secret mining of 1 billion American phone calls. Watch what they say, though. They say with this program and or other sources. I'm convinced that every one of them could have been gotten with a traditional warrant. I'm for catching terrorists. You know, I have no sympathy for the Sonaref boy. I'd just soon pull the switch after he has a trial and after he's convicted. But I don't have any sympathy for these people. But you can go after them by getting a tip. We had a tip on the Boston bomber. The tip was Russia thought he might be a terrorist. We interviewed him, and maybe we couldn't get anything from the interview. But then he went back to Chechnya. We're mining 1 billion phone calls of Americans. We're so lost in data. We've got data up to our eyeballs, but we're not spending the time to look through a targeted list of a guy who's been tipped off to us. The underwear bomber, he was tipped off to us by his dad. We still let him get on a plane and come over here. We need to do the police work that it takes to get to terrorism. The TSA. Do you think a 3-year-old American kid with spina bifida is going to blow up a plane? Do you think a veteran who's lost both legs is going to blow up a plane? We humiliate our veterans by making them take their prosthesis off to hobble through the scanners. I've been to Israel. When you go to Israel, they say, hello, Mr. Paul, and they know who you are, but not just me. They know who everybody is on the plane. I would spend more time looking at the flight manifest, and if you've been to Yemen 3 times, maybe you deserve a little more scrutiny. If you're an international traveler visiting from Pakistan, you deserve more scrutiny. After 9/11, we had a special program for student visas. Bush instituted this, and it was a good thing. For 25 countries, we looked especially hard at your student visas. Why? Because 16 of the 19 hijackers were overstaying their student visas. Was it targeting? Was it profiling? Yes, because only certain people are attacking us. Why don't we use some brain sense to go after the people who are attacking us? I tried to reinstitute this on an amendment to the immigration bill. I said, let's restart this targeted looking at student visas from certain countries. Let's also do it for refugees from certain countries. Frankly, we've admitted 70,000 people from Iraq here on asylum. I thought political asylum was when you were escaping dictatorship. We won the war, and we're admitting 70,000 people here. 95% of them are on food stamps, 80% live in government housing, and 45% of them are unemployed. I'm not against helping refugees. My church has helped people from Bosnia. I've met and helped people from Burma. But the thing is that do we need 70,000 people who are pro-Western? They should be in Iraq making their country a better country. I mean, it sounds harsh, but that's really what should happen. We don't need to have them here and immediately put them all on government assistance. But my amendment failed because they really don't want to talk about national security with regard to our borders. The Boston bomber, when we did catch the young one was killed in a firefight and the other one was wounded. A Boston policeman came to speak in Kentucky, and I was at a fundraiser, and I heard him speak. And he said something that I think is pretty important, and you may not all agree on this, but it's worth thinking about. He said, when I got to the scene, it was horrific. He said, I was applying tourniquets and trying to save people's lives, and it's just hard to imagine people blown to smithereens. And he said, then when we got stable, I was angry. We were in pursuit of these two killers, and I was angry at them, and I want to punish them, and I still feel that way. I feel this incredible anger. But he said, after the firefight was over and after we captured them, we didn't drag them through the streets and beat them to death with tire irons because we're civilized. It's what separates us from them. We will take this young man, and he is evil. There is nothing good about someone who would kill women and children and think that's going to advance their religion or advance a political cause. But we didn't beat him to death with tire irons. We're going to try him in a court of law. He's going to get an attorney. The evidence is overwhelming. Our courts, we should be proud of him. He's going to be convicted and he's going to be punished. But it's better than sending someone indefinitely somewhere around the world and not trying them. Some people just say, oh, just send them to Guantanamo Bay and we'll get more information out of them. I am for getting information out of them, but indefinitely sending people down there, particularly American citizens, is not the right way to go about it. We had a bill called indefinite detention that was attached to a bill about a year ago. It would allow an American citizen accused of terrorism to be sent to Guantanamo Bay without a charge, without a trial. You know, there's been a time in our history when we did stuff like this, when a black man in 1910 would be strung up from the nearest tree if someone accused him of rape. There was no trial, and it was an awful time in our history. We took the Japanese Americans in World War II and we put them in concentration camps. An awful time in our history. Now you may say this isn't going to be used. The president says he's not going to do it. It's an awful concept to think that we're going to send an American. Think about who a terrorist may be. There's the new criteria that's been out. One criteria, people were missing fingers on their hand, stains on their clothing, change the color of their hair. People like to pay in cash. That's not anybody in here, is it? People have multiple weapons at home. Anybody in here? People have weatherized ammunition. This is on the list of suspicions for terrorism. You think you might want a trial before you get sent to Guantanamo Bay? We do need to be careful. Also think these ideas of justice are what branch us out and make us a bigger party. And finally, I would say what makes us a bigger party is ultimately having a message of optimism. There's a painter by the name of Robert Henry, and he said, when teaching people how to paint, he says you should paint like a man coming over a hill singing. And I love the image of that. You know, can our message be one of optimism, of happiness, of a man coming over a hill singing? When I think of what our message should be, I think of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. I think of the passion of our founding fathers, of people who stood up for the Fourth Amendment, the Second Amendment, the First Amendment, with passion, even when it's uncomfortable, even when we're talking about someone who is an evil person. You think about, oh, well, terrorists are bad people, so are rapists, so are murderers. We give them all trials. That's what America's about. It's not anything that we say that we have sympathy for what they do. We want them to be punished. But we want to stand up for our system. I think when we become the party that stands up and proclaims our message like a man coming over a hill singing, then I think we'll be the dominant party again. Thank you.